The exact date when Napoleon met the first significant woman in his life is not known, but by the time Joseph married Julie Clary, Napoleon was deeply interested in her 16-year-oold sister Bernardine Eugénie Clary, also known as Désirée. Both girls were brunettes, and at this stage Désirée had not shed all her puppy fat so that, petite as she was, she had a somewhat dumpy appearance. But she was warm, affectionate and good-natured, with a smile like Mediterranean sunshine. And she had large, lustrous, slightly popping brown eyes. Her portraits show her as sexy rather than beautiful. The initial attraction for Napoleon is easy to explain. But before September 1794, Désirée probably rated no higher in his affections than Emily de Laurenti, whose hand he once lukewarmly solicited from her father, in the certain knowledge that he would be turned down. As is quite clear from the events of 1795, Napoleon liked to test the water by making frivolous marriage proposals, just to see how his social status was perceived by others, but we can certainly discount the wild story that Joseph really wanted to marry Désirée until Napoleon leaned on him by pointing out that stable should marry flighty and flighty stable. This meant the pairings should be Joseph, Julie and Napoleon. Désirée. Joseph made a hard-headed marriage of convenience to solve his financial problems, and there was never any suggestion of an automatic second connection between the Bonaparte and Clary families. There was certainly nothing special about Napoleon's feelings for Désirée in September 1794, as his first letter to her, from the Italian front, makes clear. Your unfailing sweetness and the gay openness which is yours alone inspire me with affection, dear Eugénie, but I am so occupied by work I don't think this affection ought to cut into my soul and leave a deeper scar. Scarcely coup de foudre. 2. The epithet best describing Napoleon's letters to Désirée at this juncture is patronizing. He advised her on what books she should read, how she could improve her piano playing, how to develop an acknowledged musical talent, and how she could brush up her deportment and manners. When Désirée, unsurprisingly, rebuked him for his unromantic tone, he replied with a list of her shortcomings. Yet the visits to her house from December 1, 794 onwards, while he was preparing the Corsican expedition, obviously increased his ardor, for the tone of his letters changes. You are always in my thoughts. I have never doubted your love, my sweet Eugénie. How can you think I could ever cease to love you? The romance caught fire, and on the 21st of April 1795 Napoleon became engaged to Désirée. Although it has often been said that Madame Clary opposed the match, there is no sign of this at this stage, nor of Joseph's supposed objection on the grounds that one Bonaparte in the family was enough. Since Désirée would bring in a healthy dowry, up to 10,000 francs on some estimates, the marriage made sense to the hard-headed Napoleon. It is clear from subsequent events that at some time between the 21st of April and his departure for Paris on the 7th of May Napoleon made Désirée his mistress. When the guilt-ridden Napoleon admitted this on St. Helena, his confession was disregarded as the fantasy of a dirty old man, but to construe his remarks in this way reveals an astoundingly superficial view of his psychology. To take the virginity of a girl and then not marry her was against his own old-fashioned code of honor. It was vastly different in the case of experienced women, and he always felt guilt about this. Why he did not marry her he scarcely knew at the conscious level and continued to hark back to her wistfully. But there are some important clues to the relationship and its eventual failure in the outline for a novel Napoleon wrote during the affair with Désirée, Clissold et Eugénie. It is obvious that Eugénie is Désirée and that Napoleon is Clissold. This is how he described hero and heroine. Clissold was born for war. While still a child he knew the lives of all the great captains. He meditated on military tactics at a time when other boys of his age were at school or chasing girls. As soon as he was old enough to shoulder arms, brilliant actions marked his every step. One victory succeeded another and his name was as renowned among the people as those of their dearest defenders. Eugénie was 16 years old. She was gentle, good and vivacious, with pretty eyes and of medium size. Without being ugly, she was not a beauty, but goodness, sweetness and a lively tenderness were essential parts of her nature. Clissold is the romantic hero, a loner who has reached high rank in the army while still a young man, thus making him prey to insane jealousy and insane rumor. In the countryside near Lyons he meets two sisters, Amélie and Eugénie. After some inconsequential flirting with Amélie, Clissold falls in love with Eugénie and she with him. Years go by and they have children. In what is surely a reference to his affair with Désirée, Napoleon writes, "Every night Eugénie slept with her head on her lover's shoulder or in his arms." In his new life with Eugénie, Clissold had certainly avenged men's injustice, which had vanished from his mind like a dream. The incomparable idyll comes to an end when Clissold is recalled to the army. He is away for years but every day gets a letter from Eugénie. Wounded in battle, he sends his right-hand man, Berville, to comfort Eugénie. Berville and Eugénie fall in love and, hearing of this, Clissold decides to die in battle. At 2 in the morning, just before the battle, he writes a letter of farewell to Eugénie. How many unhappy men regret being alive yet long to continue living? Only I wish to have done with life. It is Eugenie who gave me it. Farewell, my life's arbiter. Farewell, companion of my happy days. In your arms I have tasted supreme happiness. I have drained life dry in all its good things. What remains now but satiety and boredom? At 26 I have exhausted the ephemeral pleasures of fame, but in your love I have known how sweet it is to be alive. That memory breaks my heart. May you live happily and think no more of the unhappy Clissold. Kiss my sons. May they grow up without their father's ardor, for then they would be like him, victims of other men, of glory and of love. The theme of betrayal by a woman hints at what was in the Napoleonic unconscious. It squares with what we know of his deep ambivalence towards Letizia, and the conviction that she had betrayed Carlo. The seeds of disaster for the love affair with Desiree are already on show here. To marry Desiree, Napoleon seems to hint, is to expose himself to the full blast of romantic love with its almost inevitable heartache and, given his opinion of women, virtually certain betrayal. Desiree's very status as a virgin when Napoleon took her is, paradoxically, felt to be what is most threatening about her. Any chance of a spontaneous development of the romance was destroyed when Napoleon suddenly received orders to join the Army of the West, engaged in fighting the royalist counter-revolutionaries of the Vendée. This posting to an infantry command was, in effect, a demotion, and Napoleon decided to go to Paris to protest it. Accompanied by Marmont and Junot, he set off north in a post-chaise, traveling via Avignon, Montélimar, Valence, Lyons and the Saône to the Marmont family home in Burgundy. As the coach drove off, Desiree wrote, "You left half an hour ago. Only the thought of knowing you forever faithful." At which point the letter tailed off on a tear-splotched page. That Napoleon, though possibly sexually besotted, was not in love in any true sense became clear even before he reached Paris. At the Marmont house he met a bright young woman named Victorine de Chastenay, who fell under his spell at once, as she herself testifies. At dinner Victorine sang a ballad and asked Napoleon if her pronunciation was correct. He said no rather boorishly and otherwise spoke to her only in blunt monosyllables. But she was much taken with this very pale and thin general with the long greasy hair, and set out to impress him. Evidently she succeeded, for the following day after dinner she spent 4 hours alone with him, while he held forth as a literary critic. He told her he loved Ossian, hated happy endings in the theatre, and thought Shakespeare's plays were pathetic and unreadable. It is quite clear that Victorine threw herself at him. Whether the encounter ended with sexual consummation is unclear. Napoleon and his companions proceeded via Chalon, Châtillon-sur-Seine and Semur and arrived in Paris on the 25th of May. Once in the capital, Napoleon went to the Ministry of War to protest his demotion from the rank of artillery general. A stormy interview followed, after which it looked likely that Napoleon would end up on a supernumerary list as an unemployed general. The minister reiterated that the artillery quotas were full and that, as he was the last to be promoted, there was nothing for it but he must command a brigade in the Vendée. Napoleon, as usual in such an emergency, stalled by asking for 3 weeks' leave, intending in the meantime to lobby his influential friends to get him off the hook. He began collecting evidence of victimization and discovered that a number of politicians, including the Minister of War himself, held the rank and pay of a brigadier general though not on active service. When there was no resolution of the standoff after the expiry of the leave period, Napoleon found himself on half pay and reduced to living in a cheap hotel, wearing a shabby uniform, muddy boots and no gloves, and getting by on a pittance sent by Joseph. He was said to have been so poor that when dining out he wrapped the money for his bill in a piece of paper to conceal how little he was spending. No longer able to maintain Louis, he managed to find him a place in the artillery school at Chalons. Despondent and disillusioned, he cut a poor figure, as described by Laura Perman, the future Duchess d'Abrantz. At this time Napoleon was so ugly, he cared so little for his appearance, that his uncombed and unpowdered hair gave him a disagreeable look. I can still picture him entering the courtyard of the Hôtel de la Tranquillite and crossing it with an awkward, uncertain step. He wore a nasty round hat pulled down over his eyes, from which his hair, like a spaniel's ears, flopped over his frock coat. An overall sickly effect was created by his thinness and his yellow complexion. Other contemporary descriptions mention his short stature and his deep-set, gray eyes, which could look gloomy or fiery and could be changed in a trice to produce either a charming or a terrifying effect. Some observers noted his unusually delicate features or his spaniel's ears haircut, cut square under the ears and falling to the shoulders, while others spoke of the peculiar charm of the lines of his mouth and his palpable physical presence, something no other Bonaparte possessed. But all were agreed about the predominant tone of depression. Certainly in these dark days in Paris in the summer of 1795 Napoleon contemplated suicide. At other times he thought of going into service with the Sultan of Turkey, always provided his beloved Joseph would agree to serve as French consul at Chios. He actually submitted a formal application to the War Ministry to be allowed to serve in Turkey, but the application was not immediately processed, because of incompetence by ministry clerks. The mixture of depression and emotion for Joseph comes through in a letter written to Joseph in June. Whatever may happen to you, remember that you cannot possibly have a warmer friend than I, one to whom you are more dear or who is more sincerely desirous for your happiness. Life is a mere dream that fades. Should you go away and suspect that it may be for some time, let me have a miniature of yourself. We have lived together for so long and been so close that our hearts have become as one. You know more than anyone how completely mine belongs to you. Napoleon's letters from this period, both to Joseph and Desiree, are gloomy and depressive. The epistles to Joseph oscillate between the sentiment that life has little meaning, and he would welcome death, and a hyper-cynicism and money obsession, heightened by the presence all around him in Paris of quick-fix speculators, shady get-rich-quick characters, parvenus, arrivistes and the nouveau riches. There is only one thing to do in this world, and that is to keep acquiring money, and more money, power and more power. All the rest is meaningless. There is much about the Napoleon of 1795 to back Madame de Remusat's assertion that Napoleon was bold and resourceful only when luck was running his way, but when at a low ebb he was timid, circumspect and uncertain. There was little encouraging news from Joseph, just that Lucien, still destitute in Saint-Maximin, had been arrested as a Jacobin a full year after Thermidor but then released after 2 weeks. To Desiree he wrote that he had a romantic soul, an imagination of ice, a head of ice, a bizarre heart and melancholy inclinations. This was hardly what she wanted to hear, for she was busy writing that she was doing everything she could to make herself worthy of him, adding, however, that she feared he would forget all about the pleasures of Marseille in the heady, hedonistic atmosphere of Paris. So uninterested was Napoleon in Desiree that he let 9 days go by before going down to the poste restante to retrieve her tear-stained letters. But it was typical of him to blow hot and cold. On the 24th of June he decided to have his portrait painted for Desiree. In July, when she was with her family in Genoa, he complained to Joseph that he never heard from her, did not know whether she was alive or dead, and chided Joseph with never mentioning her. Maybe Desiree, from the vantage point of the French capital, now looked small beer, or, more likely, she was a card he cynically kept in play while he investigated his prospects of making a more financially lucrative or politically advantageous match. Certainly he did the rounds of eligible women, sounding out prospects. He probably did make overtures to Laura Perman's 40-year-old widowed mother, and it may well be, as one of Brantz relates, that he was scornfully rejected. On the other hand, the story that he proposed marriage to the 60-year-old Emile de Montensier seems like obvious black propaganda spread by his enemies. Other women whom he may have reconnoitred with a view to a marriage of convenience include Aimée de la Boucherie and Aimée de la Spada. Also in his sights for a while was 30-year-old Grace Dalrymple, later Lady Elliot, a Scotswoman who was an adventuress in a double sense, having given birth to an illegitimate daughter by the Prince of Wales and been imprisoned in France during the Terror. A walk in the Tuileries convinced them there could never be a meeting of minds. Napoleon, a one-time admirer of the English, now associated them with Paoli's treachery and had all the fanatical Anglophobia of the newly converted. He told Grace he wished the earth would open and swallow up all Englishmen. She replied that the remark was scarcely tactful in her presence. Napoleon protested that he believed all Scots loved France more than they did England, but Grace hastened to assure him that her heart was in England even more than Scotland. One woman who certainly was a salient consideration to Napoleon during the dreadful limbo of summer 1795 was their Italian. How Napoleon came into her orbit is uncertain. Junot recalls that he and Marmont ran into Napoleon's schoolmate Bourrienne in Paris. The three of them then played a penurious version of the Three Musketeers to Bonaparte's D'Artagnan, roaming around Paris and knocking on the doors of the influential. For some reason, possibly his memory of Napoleon at Toulon, one of the doors opened to them was that of 40-year-old Paul Barras, one of the 5 most powerful men in Paris. Barras was part of the famous salon which met at La Chaumière, the elegant house made up to look like a cottage, where lived Jean Lambert Tallien, architect of Robespierre's downfall and president of the Thermidorian Convention. But the more significant inhabitant was his new wife Thérèse Cabarrus. At the influential Chaumière salon could be found Barras, Stanislas Fréron, the young financial genius Gabriel Ouvrard, Joseph Chenier, said to have connived at the guillotining of his brother André, the poet, during the Terror, the American envoy James Monroe, together with Germaine de Staël and notorious women of the time, including Fortuny Hamelin, Juliette Recamier and Rose de Beauharnais. It was overwhelmingly a milieu of the powerful, the beautiful and, above all, the young. Ouvrard was 28, Tallien 27, and at 40 Barras and Fréron counted as old men. Still only 22 La Cabarrus, the reigning beauty of Thermidorian society, had already packed a lifetime's adventure into her glittering career. She had been married and divorced by 21 and had narrowly escaped the guillotine during the Terror. Both pleasure-loving and philoprogative, she had numerous lovers, including Barras and the banker Ouvrard, and would end her career as the Princess de Chimay. Napoleon was at once fascinated and repelled by her, fascinated by her bewitching beauty and power over men, yet repelled by her promiscuity and the airs and graces she gave herself. The story that Napoleon made overtures to her and was rebuffed is absurd. At this juncture Napoleon was a nobody and Thereja could have her pick of any man in the Thermidorian elite, and did so. There's Italian symbolized the new hedonistic Paris, given over to sensuality and gratification. Paris was a world away from the repressed revolutionary society Napoleon had last seen in 1792. The Thermidorian reaction released rivers of the pleasure principle, pent up by Robespierrean austerity, and in this the new society resembled Restoration England after the Puritanism of Cromwell, or the luxury and opulence of the Second Empire after the 1848 revolution. Theaters flourished as never before. Conspicuous consumption was the order of the day as women spent fortunes on gowns and men on coaches, fine wines and their losses at the card table. Sensualists found new avenues to explore, and the Thermidorian period is even credited with the invention of lunch, as the old-style dinner hour was pushed back and a new forked meal took its place. Needless to say, all this ostentatious luxury at the top contrasted with the most crippling poverty and destitution in the Parisian slums. For the common man, it seemed, 5 years of revolution had been in vain. Most of all, the new order was a permissive society with sexuality, and hence the role of women underlined. In July Napoleon wrote to Joseph, "Everywhere in Paris you see beautiful women. Here alone of all places on earth they appear to hold the reins of government, and the men are crazy about them, think of nothing else and love only for and through them. A woman needs to come to Paris for 6 months to learn what is her due, and to understand her own power. Here only, they deserve to have such influence." Apparently Desiree read this letter, for she wrote an incoherent letter to Napoleon containing the following: "A friend of Joseph's, a deputy, has arrived. He says that everyone enjoys themselves immensely in Paris. I hope that the noisy pleasures there will not allow you to forget the peaceful country ones of Marseille, and that walks in the Bois de Boulogne with Madame Tallien will not allow you to forget the riverside ones with your bonne petite Eugenie." Napoleon wrote a reassuring letter to say that when he last dined with Madame Tallien, her looks seemed to have faded. Whether Desiree was taken in by this transparent lie about a glowing 22-year-old beauty is unlikely, but she can hardly fail to have noticed that one of Napoleon's subsequent letters was scarcely the effusion of a man madly in love. "Tender Eugenie, you are young. Your feelings are going to weaken, then falter, later you will find yourself changed. Such is the dominion of time. I do not accept the promise of eternal love you give in your latest letter, but I substitute for it a promise of inviolable frankness. The day you love me no more, swear to tell me. I make the same promise." Napoleon's new patron, Paul Comte de Barras, typified the post-Thermidor and Directory regime. A former career soldier and voluptuary from Provence, who had been bankrupted in 1789, Barras had a career as an ex-Jacobin. He was one of the regicides of 1793 in turncoat, a deeply unpleasant man even by the not very elevated standards of the Thermidorian regime. He was corrupt, immoral, cynical, venal, sardonic and opportunistic. A card-sharp who was known to cheat when his instincts failed him. He ran a house that was little more than a glorified brothel, full of crooked stockjobbers and ladies of the night. Napoleon was never so much an opportunist as during this period under Barras's wing at the Tallien Salon. Here was the erstwhile firebrand Jacobin, friend of the Robespierres, dining at the house of the most reactionary man of Thermidor, the man who had compassed the downfall of the sea-green incorruptible. Napoleon had already learned the lesson that ideology was for fools, that the ambitious man went where the power was, and whatever his private feelings about Tallien's wife, he kept them to himself, and tried to charm and cajole her. Although as an officer not on the active list he was not entitled to a new uniform and was reduced to wearing his old, threadbare one at her parties, Theja listened sympathetically to his tale of woe and used her immense influence to have a new one issued to him. Gabriel Ouvrard, the banker, recalled that of all the visitors to the Chaumière, Napoleon was the least memorable. How it must have galled this young man, who wanted always to be first in everything, to have to take a back seat. He became more and more aware that in Paris, his exploits at Toulon notwithstanding, he was regarded as just an insignificant officer with a provincial accent. Received Parisian pronunciation was almost becoming a Thermidorian badge of honor, but Napoleon retained an unwitting Jacobin legacy in the coarseness of his demotic speech, having become used to the knee-jerk foul-mouthery appropriate to Citizen Bonaparte. He found it hard to adjust to the refined elegance of Le Chaumière, where the finely turned epigrams of Germain de Staël contrasted with the barefaced sexual promiscuity behind closed doors. Napoleon took a particular dislike to de Staël's close friend Juliette Récamier, possibly because she was virginal and had a known dislike of sex, whereas to Napoleon sexuality was woman's destiny. Fortunately, the 19-year-old Creole beauty Fortuny Hamelin, who was reputed to have paraded up the Champs-Élysées bare-breasted for a dare, also disliked Récamier as a pretentious prude and made common cause with Napoleon. She became an admirer and close friend, and the support Napoleon got from her and Thérèse led him to a tactless revelation in a letter to Désirée that he now admired royalist women. She, on the other hand, had first known him as a devout Jacobin, beautiful as in old romances and as learned as scholars. All these frivolous women have one thing in common, an astonishing love of bravery and glory. Most of them are so violently royalist, and their labor and their pleasure is to win respectable people over to their cause. Suddenly, on the 17th of August 1795, the bombshell burst. Napoleon received an express order to join the Army of the West or see his military career at an end. Napoleon was desperate and at his wits' end. To comply meant accepting that he had been demoted from the rank of artillery general to a common or garden infantry brigadier in the endless Vendée campaign, from which could come no glory or advancement. It almost meant serving under the Republican hero César Hoche, who had driven the Austrians out of Alsace in 1793. Napoleon shrewdly sensed that the ambitious Hoche, just 1 year older, was in competition for the same space and the same glittering prizes, and that to serve under him might mean ending up in front of a firing squad. Jealous of his prestige and aware that Hoche had a reputation as a martinet, and would not tolerate the slightest insubordination, Bonaparte, the freewheeling political intriguer and shameless adventurer, knew that the Vendée was the end of the line. Hoche would not permit a day's leave, never mind years of it, and took the same draconian attitude to furlough that Napoleon himself would take when emperor. Napoleon did his best to avoid the inevitable. First he tried the old dodge of sending in a sick note, but the War Office trumped that ace by declaring that the doctor who wrote the certificate was not competent to do so. In despair, Napoleon appealed to Béranger as his last hope. Influenced by their Italian as well as his own partiality for the young supplicant, Béranger got him a post in the Topographical Bureau of the Committee of Public Safety. It was an exalted position, guaranteeing his rank as brigadier general, but not quite so elevated as Napoleon boasted when he told Joseph he had replaced Carnot there. In fact, the bureau was run by a quadrumvirate of generals. Carnot had set up the bureau in 1792 as a kind of general staff, and it was supposed to be a preserve of the brightest and best military minds. Béranger's quick action to help his protégé was aided by the turn of events. On the 29th of June, an Austrian counter-offensive routed General Kellerman and undid all the French victories of 1794. Kellerman claimed that Nice was in danger and asked for help. The government was already searching for men with Italian experience when Béranger put forward Napoleon's name. His first memorandum, arguing for a significant transfer of troops from the armies of the Rhine and the Pyrenees to the Italian front, where Schurrer now took over from Kellerman, simply mirrored his 1794 arguments. Ironically, on the very day he was appointed, his old project for going to Turkey came to life again. The bureaucratic muddle at the Ministry of War had been sorted out and passed to the Commission of the Exterior, who now informed him that his proposal to go to Turkey as head of a military mission to the Sultan had been approved. But there was still a snag. He had not informed the Committee of Public Safety of his Turkish application. Having just stretched a point and given him a prestigious post, the committee was offended at being approached with this fresh request and turned it down. Perhaps this contretemps was still in the committee's mind a few weeks later, or perhaps it was simply a change in the personnel on the committee, but on his September Napoleon was informed that he had been struck off the list of generals. The reason given was his refusal to serve in the Vendée campaign. But this was grossly illogical, for, if the argument was valid, he should never have been offered the post in the Topographical Bureau in the first place. His position was now the worst ever, and for 3 weeks he was in desperate straits, beset by pressing financial worries. Foreseeing now that all his ambitions might come to naught, he decided to reactivate the relationship with Désirée. She must have been surprised, after all the previous cold missives, to receive a warm and enthusiastic screed, talking excitedly of his plans for introducing her to Parisian society, and adding, "Let us hurry, beloved Eugenie, time flies, old age is almost upon us." But after that, nothing. In the meantime, Napoleon's career had taken another, successful twist, and he no longer needed Désirée. If we judge from his conscious actions alone, Napoleon's treatment of Désirée seems despicable. To apply for service in Turkey even while he spoke to a 17-year-old of introducing her to high society denotes a secretive, unscrupulous, duplicitous and chillingly ambitious personality. Yet if Napoleon in late September stared career disaster in the face, his protector Bérez confronted an even more serious situation, one where his very life was in jeopardy. A new constitution on 2 June 795 placed executive power in the hands of a 5-man directory and vested legislative authority in a lower chamber of 500 and an upper house of ancients. But the decrees of 22 and the 30th of August 795, the so-called decree of 2/3, stipulated that 2/3 of the new assembly had to be chosen from members of the old convention. The intention was to protect the new men of property and prevent royalists returning to power. On Demi-Ira, led by the royalists Le Pelletier, 7 Parisian sections declared themselves to be in rebellion. General Menu, commander of the Paris garrison, made it plain that he sympathized with the rebels. There were 20,000 National Guardsmen in the capital who could conceivably be swayed to the royalist side. Having experienced Red Terror and the revolt of the sans-culottes, Paris now faced White Terror and that ultimate paradox, counter-revolution from the right against an extreme right-wing government. The distinction was that the threat was directed against the men of new property by a motley alliance between ultramontane royalists and dissatisfied sections of the National Guard. There is considerable controversy over Napoleon's exact movements and motives in the 48 hours following the Paris Rising. Both Bérez and Napoleon in their very different memoirs grossly distort the record. Some have claimed it is black propaganda to suggest that Napoleon flirted with the royalists. Napoleon allegedly said to Junot, "If only the Parisians would name me their chief, I would see to it that the Tuileries would be invaded within 2 hours, and we would chase those miserable deputies out of there." Since this story comes from Laura, Duchess of Abrantes, it is safest to disregard it. Yet on St. Helena, Napoleon told General Bertrand he was undecided which way to jump, and was inclining to the royalist side when Bérez sent for him. Bérez stoked up the rumors in his memoirs by claiming that when the trouble broke out he at once thought of Napoleon and sought him out, but that he could not be found at his lodgings, his café or any of his usual haunts. The obvious inference was that he had been bargaining with the other side. Yet another story was that Napoleon was in bed with a blonde called Suzanne when he was missing. According to Bérez, he discerned Napoleon's duplicity but outfoxed him by offering him command of the artillery, provided he accepted within 3 minutes. Napoleon did so, whereupon Bérez took him to the session of the Committee of Public Safety in the Tuileries, and got an order signed on the spot, remitting Napoleon to his full army rank. The historian can only cut through the thickets of rumor and innuendo, sidestep Napoleon's inflated claim that he was officially designated second in command under Bérez, and concentrate on what actually happened. Throughout 12 Vendémiaire, the tocsin call to arms never ceased to sound. The men of Thermidor were in a panic and looked to Bérez to save them. He began by releasing hundreds of Jacobins from prison and hiring a number of unemployed officers. He then sent word to Napoleon, who heeded the call, whether immediately or after a judicious interval is uncertain.